Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I am Tiara Hall-Edward. I am the coordinator of the Connection Center here on campus. And welcome to Racial Healing for Students of Color. So I'm pleased to welcome Dr. David P. Rivera. He's an associate professor of counselor education at Queens College, City University of New York. Dr. Rivera consults on issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. His research explores cultural competency development, issues impacting the marginalization and well-being of people of color, and oppressed sexual orientation and gender identity groups, with a focus on microaggressions. Wow. Dr. Rivera's presentation will help BIPOC students, and he will get into that, face experiences such as imposter phenomenon, microaggression, and invalidating campus climate and mental health stigma. So these issues, which result in race-related stress, can impact a student's ability to succeed. Please remain muted until asked to speak, and feel free to ask questions using the chat function at any time, but there will also be an opportunity at the end to ask questions. We are recording today's presentation and we'll post it on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion website. And without further ado, I will now turn the program over to Dr. Rivera.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me with you all again today. And I did a program for your campus, I think in November of last semester, on implicit bias and microaggressions and how to handle them. So some of the material will be a little similar, but there will be definitely some differences in terms of our focus. So we are going to be talking about racial healing for students of color in particular. The first part of the workshop will be focused on critical consciousness raising. So going over specific phenomenon that BIPOC people are likely to encounter in their life, and that can help us explain the various disparities that people of color experience, including in mental health, wellness, and healthcare situations. Critical consciousness raising, it's a term that is being used quite widely now, but it's also an intervention in and of itself, expanding our knowledge base of various critical issues so that we can just help make sense of our lives in more practical, meaningful ways. Then we'll talk somewhat about racial trauma and the impact on student wellness. And then we'll go into racial healing, and I'll offer some skills and resources for how to address these issues when you encounter them. So I know we have a mixture of folks on the program today. We have students, we have people in staff, faculty, administrative positions. And so this is relevant for everybody. You'll probably hear me talking more directly to students in this talk, but know that all this information can be helpful regardless of the role that you play on campus. You might be the person who introduces a concept to somebody or a framework to somebody for the first time that can have a real meaningful impact on their lives. So even if you don't identify as a Black, Indigenous person of color, this will still be very relevant for you and the work that you're doing at Rockland. So I want to mention that I do also have community college experience, and early in my career, I worked at Prince George's Community College, and then I worked at Bronx Community College for a bit here in the city. And so I just really appreciate and value what a community college experience provides for members of the community, but also for those that are attending the institution. I'm going to start us off with the mindfulness moment. I find that in this virtual dynamic that we often find ourselves in, that we're not allowing enough space for transition in between activities, and a brief mindfulness moment can help that. It'll also help us some other things that I'll explain.
Welcome to the sober breathing space. SOBER stands for stop, observe, breathe, expand, and respond. Stop whatever it is that you are doing and whatever it is you are about to do, and allow yourself to just simply be right here in the present moment. Observe what's happening in your body, noticing any sensations that are present in your body right now. Check in with your emotions, noticing whatever feelings are there for you right now, without judging anything, just allowing them to be as they are. Notice where your thoughts are right now, whether they're in the past or in the future or in the present. With the next breath in, gathering your awareness. With the next breath out, bringing your awareness now just to the breath. As best you can, keeping your full attention on the sensations of breathing. Breathing in, I know that I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I know that I'm breathing out. In, out. Whenever you notice your mind wandering, as best you can, simply bring your awareness back to the next breath. Breathing in, breathing out. In, out. Gathering your awareness again with your next in-breath. Breathing out, expanding your awareness to a sensation of your whole body being breathed. Checking in again with the body. What do you notice? What sensations are present right now? Are they the same or are they different than earlier? Checking in with your emotions. What feelings are present right now? Checking in again with your thoughts. Where is your mind right now? And with awareness, as best you can, responding to the situation, carrying on with your day, shifting out of autopilot mode and into mindful awareness.
All right. So thank you for participating. If you did, I'm putting into the chat where I get this resource from. So this is the first intervention that I'm sharing with you, mindfulness. So mindfulnessforteens.com is where this come from. The voice that you were hearing was Dr. Vo, who is a Vietnamese Canadian physician who put this website together and has been really preaching the usefulness and utility of mindfulness, especially for young people. Mindfulness does something in our brains. It's not just something that helps us to relax and to feel more calm, but there's actually a neurological process or processes that are being impacted by mindfulness meditation. And one of those is helping our neurons to connect with each other in more optimal ways. When our minds are overly stressed, when we're overly stressed, we often experience what's referred to as neural disintegration, where the neurons in our brains aren't communicating with each other at speeds that they should be. And so we might find ourselves, when we're overly stressed, having a fuzzy mind, having a hard time recalling common words, maybe having a shorter fuse with anger or with impatience or what have you. Maybe we might forget what we're doing in the moment or what have you, or maybe even feel lethargic or fatigued. And that's possibly because the parts of our brains that should be communicating with each other so that we can be optimal human beings aren't. And what research is finding is that mindfulness is one of those very easily accessible, practical antidotes to a neurally disintegrated mind. It actually promotes neural integration, the optimal communication between those neurons. So even just practicing this for a few minutes a day can actually do some meaningful help with helping to repair some of those damaged neural pathways in your brain. And we're still learning much more about mindfulness. It is definitely not a new concept. It's been practiced for millennia in Eastern cultures, relatively new in Western cultures, and I want to acknowledge that and make sure that whenever we are using mindfulness that we're doing it in a respectful way, especially given that many cultures have been practicing this for millennia and it's a part of their cultural experience. So again, we're going to get into critical consciousness raising. I'm going to be talking about some things that might bring up some emotional experiences in you. And if you do, feel free to step away and take some time for yourself if you need to, knowing that some of this information may be stressful in nature. Also utilize the chat. For those of you on the call, feel free to even introduce yourselves right now. Something that we would do if we were in person. So go ahead and introduce yourselves to kind of help to create this community for the next hour that we have together. And as we go through these concepts, if you have any questions, or even if you have more to add, I'm an expert in these areas, but by no means do I claim to be the only expert. Everyone has some knowledge to bring, and let's share that as much as possible in the chat. Okay, let's move on. So I'm going to start off with kind of framing our conversation in what I think of as an ecological model. And this is something that I obviously did not create. Those of you that have taken any education courses or developmental psych probably have heard of Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who is credited with bringing the psychological and education world with the idea of an ecological perspective for understanding human development, right? And so we know that humans don't exist in a void. We're embedded in environments, our families of origin, our communities of origin, the institutions that we navigate, education, healthcare, criminal justice, economics, the government, the political systems, et cetera. And then the historical context that we all find ourselves embedded in. And that's one part that hasn't really been spoken so much about in ecological models, and something that we're emphasizing, or that I'm emphasizing, that's important, is that we think about the histories that we come from, the histories of the communities that we're embedded in, the history of the institution that you're attending, so the history of Rockland. All of that has an impact on your current functioning, right? And so it's good to think about our development, how we understand the world around us, rooted in the communities that we're embedded in, but also that historical context. What I find is that all too often when we think about maybe even trying to understand how discrimination currently functions, that folks will often take an ahistorical perspective and think about these issues on the individual level of functioning only, right? When we're stuck in that individual ahistorical kind of context, it leaves us very little space to kind of interrogate more deeply what's going on. When we add the historical context, we can think about if we're experiencing something at our educational institution and you're a person of color, or you're a woman, or you're someone with an ability issue, or you're first gen to go to college, or you come from a low income background, to know that those experiences and identities have only been relatively recently integrated into the higher education system. It's only been over the past 50 years or so that we've seen purposeful integration and inclusion of marginalized populations, right? And so that's relatively recent in the whole history of higher education. So it's good to kind of, again, contextualize our experiences so that we can have a deeper, more nuanced understanding of what's going on, which will then help us to understand what's needed in order to reduce, again, the oppressions that we're experiencing and induce more healing, affirming, validating experiences. I see some people introducing themselves, so continue to do that. This leads us to thinking about, again, structural racism. Again, building this away from just the individual manifestations of discrimination, but what's going on structurally? How are oppressions built into the systems that we navigate on a regular basis? And that's what we're referring to when we think about structural racism. Again, it's the institutions, the policies, the practices that are embedded within an institution that have been developed probably centuries ago, right? That we still kind of rely on to this very day. And if something was developed centuries ago, that means it was probably developed without the input of people from marginalized backgrounds, right? And so that means that the structures that we're currently navigating, including in higher education, have already been built, and they've been built for those who were in power at the time, right? So those that might come from a white racial background, from a background of financial means, from a history of people that had been going to college already in their families, et cetera, people that were able-bodied, people that were often heterosexual, or at least heterosexually identified at the time, right? And so thinking about, again, that history and how our institutions were developed helps us to understand the dynamics that we are currently contending with. And so the structural racism, as we're experiencing it now, often operates at the subconscious or unconscious level of experience because of how insidiously embedded these phenomenon are within our institutions. We think about how structural racism manifests. We don't have to look very far. One area that we can look into is just the demographics of our institutions. Who's represented, who's included, and who's not. If we were to think about the entire population of college-going people, students and faculty in the nation, and were to kind of aggregate them into one institution. Now, I do not like to aggregate data very often. That often will kind of miss an intricate, nuanced storylines and populations. But for this experience, I want to kind of think about think about the entire population of people in higher ed institutions as going to one institution that can help us see what's going on nationally. We look at students and we see that students are almost mirroring what we find in the mainstream population of people living in the United States. However, when we transition to faculty, right, we're seeing that those numbers often do not mirror the populations in mainstream society. And so we think about, especially our Black and Latinx faculty only make up relatively 5% each of total faculty. However, those numbers don't match the students, right? So we see about 13.4% of students in 2018 were Black, but only 5.5% were of faculty were Black. And the same is kind of true for Hispanic Latinx students. And so when I think about this, I want to think about what kind of environment this promotes when we're not seeing faculty or experiencing faculty that share identities with all of the students. So think about possibly an accounting student, right? And so I'm just using this as a general example. Let's say you have an accounting student who is taking accounting classes, wanting to be an accountant. And let's say it's a Black student and they've never had a professor that is Black. That can send a covert message and sometimes overt message about their belongingness in that profession. If I'm not seeing people like me in this profession or in this institution, it's probably going to have an impact on how I feel about my sense of belongingness in that profession or that institution, right? And so this may be one of the reasons why we still see disparities across many of our occupations when we look at racial representation. And it could be that students are not seeing themselves reflected accurately. And so maybe they are making different decisions about what to do with their professions going on down the road. Just one example of how structural racism manifests itself within the higher education system. Then we come down to microaggressions. So I often think about microaggressions as being the manifestations of structural racism or structural oppressions. Microaggressions just don't come out of nowhere. We're normed to be microaggressive in nature. So I am an expert in microaggressions. I've been studying them since 2006 before they became a mainstream term. And what I find is that when we talk about microaggressions on the interpersonal level alone, that it's hard for us to understand the true nature of microaggressions and where they come from, and how every single one of us is going to be somebody who is going to enact microaggressions, right? Because society has normed us to be microaggressive. We learned these behaviors. Nobody was born microaggressive because of DNA. At least I don't know that. We'll see what science reveals later on down the road. Maybe we've been conditioned so much that maybe it is being passed down that way. But I do know that socially, microaggressions are reinforced in our interactions that we have with those around us, our interactions that we have with the media, social media, with the TV, with the radio, whatever media you're consuming, print news. All you have to look at is, I don't have a magazine around me, but I bet if I had a magazine, I can find an ad that is monopolizing microaggressions to sell their products. Very, very common. Next time you're looking at an ad, look at what the messages are that are embedded in there. Think about who is the target audience. Think about who's being excluded as well. Those messages become quite apparent. So we're normed to be this way. And so I think that's an important concept to take away, because sometimes folks, when they feel as if they are just innately microaggressive, that they might feel like they don't have any room to change, right? And so if we're normed into being a way, if we're socialized into being in a way, we can also be socialized into being a different way, right? So for those of you that may not be familiar with microaggressions, which I highly doubt, I'm pretty sure that probably everyone on this session has heard about them and probably can describe them. Just to go over the definition again, though, that these are very brief and commonplace. So they occur very frequently. A person who comes from a marginalized background is likely to experience these multiple times in the same day. They can be verbal, behavioral, but they can also be embedded in the environment. One mistake that I naively made at the beginning of the pandemic was that I'm going to experience less microaggressions because now I'm at home most of the time. I was wrong. Again, all I have to do is turn on the TV, turn on the radio via Alexa, go onto my phone, and there's a deluge of microaggressions there. maybe some that aren't directed directly towards me, but we can be the vicarious recipients of discrimination that can still have similar impacts. So again, they don't have to be necessarily triggered by somebody that you're interacting with directly. You can observe them, or you can be taking in them via media or some kind of other environmental aggression. People are often unaware that they occur. However, people often will focus on the intent behind a microaggression. A very common response when somebody talks to somebody about being microaggressive is that they say, oh, I didn't intend that to happen. That wasn't my intention. Or you might just be overreacting. You're just making a mountain out of a molehill or a big deal out of something that's a small issue. Well, that's actually wrong, right? Intention, I don't really care about intention when it comes to microaggressions. I care about the impact that the microaggression has on somebody. So that's where we should be living in that dialogue. So you might have to contend with this when you address them, where somebody wants to have an intention argument, but I would redirect them to having an impact argument, because that's already happened. The damage has already been done. We can't reverse it. When we think about the legal sphere of life, there's actually laws that are out there for unintentional acts of harm. We call that, in the case of murder, manslaughter, right? And so we still uphold that in the law. And so we have to kind of apply the same framework when it comes to these kinds of interactions too, right? So there's precedent for that in society. What might they look like environmentally on your campus or on any campus? Again, the demographics. Do folks look like me here? The curriculum, am I seeing parts of myself accurately reflected in the curriculum? Not just reflected, but accurately reflected. There are so many lies that we've been taught in our history books, our sociology books, our psychology books. I can name every, and I throw my own discipline in there, that have been created and proliferated over time that we have to interrogate, right? And so just because we might be included in the curriculum, we have to make sure that we're accurately included in that curriculum. Cultural student program. We're currently in Black History Month. Happy Black History Month, everybody. And it's an important time for us to kind of remember and celebrate all the contributions that Black folks have made to this country over the course of probably 5-6 centuries, right? Not just what's going on now. So we must reflect over the entire history. However, we have to do this year round. And so I kind of think about our cultural months as being just a kind of a reminder that I need to continue to do this, right? It's not good enough for me just to focus on this 1 month out of the year, because our students are with us 12 months out of the year, right? So they deserve the attention each and every month. Multicultural Affairs and Diversity Offices. You might be thinking, why do you have that on there? Well, if that's the only place a student feels comfortable, right, then that's a problem, right? Our students should feel comfortable, like they feel belongingness across campus. I know when I reflect back on my undergrad experience 20 plus years ago, the Multicultural Resource Center felt like the only safe space on campus for me, right? And we celebrated that, but that was actually problematic, right? I should have felt welcomed in the cafeteria, in the quad, in every classroom, but I wasn't. So if that's the only space that you feel comfortable, interrogate that and think about how come that's the reason. And I don't want to get rid of these offices by any means. They need to remain and they have an important function. However, the rest of the campus needs to get on board as well to make sure that we're feeling welcomed. Students, and this is where I want you to chime in here, and everyone can participate, not just students, but I want you to kind of put in the chat, what are the types of microaggressions that you've experienced on campus? And you can code this if you want. If you don't want to, I'm not asking folks to call people out, so don't put names here, but just qualities of microaggressions that you experience. And these are some of the very common ones that students are still experiencing. I've been using these images for probably 10 years now. I wish that I can just change them out, but these are still the experiences I'm hearing students on my campus at Queens tell me about, and that I'm hearing students across the country talk about whenever I have these kinds of sessions. And so one, if you're a Black person and you have just an opinion, you're often ascribed to be angry, especially if you're a Black woman, right? Just having an opinion, you're ascribed anger, and that probably comes from the microaggression theme of criminality that is often ascribed to Black folks and to Latinx folks, and that we often see happening at a very, very early age. There's data to show that young Black children, young Black girls even in primary school are the targets of punishment and of harsher punishments compared to their white peers, right? And so that's starting very early, and that follows all the way through through life. We have another young person holding up, no, where are you really from? Probably the follow-up question to where are you from? Something that is completely fine to ask, but when we don't believe the person, right, that is questioning their nativity, that is questioning their personhood in some kind of way, right? And so that follow-up question is when it becomes microaggressive. And you see this person, if you're visually able to see them, this image rolling their eyes upwards, right? Kind of like in a, not again, I'm having to answer this same question and people are not believing me. The middle one has to do with how students of color are often treated in the classroom situation where they're either the product or they endure the experience of being racially spotlighted. And that's where they're asked to be the representative voice of their entire group, which is just impossible. Nobody can be the voice of their entire group. I identify as Latinx, Mexican American. I can talk about what it's like for David Rivera to be a Mexican American, but I can't talk about Mexican Americans in general because that population is so extremely diverse. The counter to that is racial ignoring, where oftentimes students of color will report that when they raise their hands up, that they're often not called upon, and maybe it's a white student that's called upon instead. So the voices are really erased in both situations when they're not asked to bring in their authentic selves, their own intellect, their own wisdom into the conversation. They're being ignored. And the last one I often joke about as being my favorite because that happens to me so often where I might even be giving a talk like this and I'm introduced with the wrong Spanish surname. It's become so prevalent in my life that even my family and friends have made a joke about it that we use to kind of deal and cope with it. And I wouldn't encourage others to do that, but it's so frequent. And so our names are so intricately a part of our identities, right? They're often the first thing that we respond to, right? As an infant. And we see this happening for many students of color that might not have a westernized name, where I'm even hearing students tell me that faculty will give them a nickname, right? Give them a nickname without their permission, right? We shouldn't be renaming people, right? We should be able to try to pronounce at least the names as appropriately and properly as possible, and to take that time to really see our students and to use their names. Because again, think about yourself. Would you want to be misnamed or what have you? So I see some things in here. I've heard it also labeled as token student. Yep, so being tokenized is definitely when you're being asked or to be the representation of your group. We could even see this in people that are represented on various committees and what have you, right? If you're the only one there, how come, right? Is it because you're only being asked to be there because of filling some kind of a quota number, or are people really valuing your opinion, who you are? And then another person wrote in here, yes, being a strong opinionated Black woman, you're often viewed as being an angry Black woman. So yeah, so again, such a common experience. And again, something that we have to start targeting in many, many ways, starting again with early childhood education, because these experiences start early and last across the lifetime. What we find with microaggressions is that it's not just one instance of microaggression that causes harm. It's often the accumulation of microaggressions over the course of one's days, one's weeks, one's years, that when not addressed and not processed can lead to a lot of the disparities and dysfunctions that research is showing. So we're finding, in all the studies that I've been a part of, we're finding that there are mental health challenges that people report when they experience large numbers of microaggressions. We're finding that it might even be something that is precluding folks from certain professions, maybe precluding people from getting promoted, right? And so there are a number of things that can be detrimentally impacted from microaggressions. Another one is internalized suppression, something that we need to be talking about much more frequently than we are right now. This is when all of these experiences, because we experience them so frequently, because the messages of microaggression, of stereotype are so dominant in society that we can't escape them, even when we know they're wrong. So I know I did the study for Latinx students, the very first one, or for Latinx people that found, criminality, that were ascribed to lower intelligence, that were ascribed to be alcoholics and drunkards, that our language and our language and speech patterns are pathologized, using Spanish is pathologized, et cetera. That even though I know those things aren't wrong, right? I've proven myself that I am intellectually capable. I know many others are. So I know those are fallacies. However, because I'm I'm inundated with these messages day in, day out, right? A part of me still believes them. And that's when it becomes internalized oppression, right? Is when we start to innately or in some way subconsciously, unconsciously start to believe these lies that we've been taught, that we internalize them, right? And so we might even find ourselves believing or endorsing these negative stereotypes in some types of ways, right? What often happens as well is that we will attribute or we will ascribe these internalized oppressions to other members of our group because of, again, the lies of, that there's only space for one of you here, right? And so that means that you also have to keep everyone else, even if they look like you, right? And so we might see this kind of functioning happening. Studies have been done with women and with people of color to show how we inadvertently will project our oppressions onto other members of our own in-groups, right? And so again, that's just perpetuating, again, these stereotypes and these microaggressions that are not of our own doing, but again, that are the voices of the oppressor that we have internalized in a very, very pernicious and insidious way. Continue talking in this, I say. Yeah, when people of color speak well, they are accused of acting white, right? And so there's so many of these negative attributes that we are contending with when we're just trying to be who we are, right? And it's because when we're trying to be who we are openly and unapologetically, it's going often against a script that people have in their minds for who we should be and how we should act. And so we're often pushing up against those in many ways. Internalized racism, again, a product of internalized oppression, is again might be a result of sustaining systemic racism. It can also be an adaptation, a survival mechanism, right? And it's often a trauma reaction, right? And as I mentioned, can include discriminating against people who look like you in terms of believing those negative stereotypes, and sometimes developing actual hate or disregard for parts of who we are, right? So that's why it's important that we think about, learn about internalized oppression. I'm giving you a snapshot of it. Of course, there's so many more dynamics that are embedded with it. Some of the products of internalized oppression, though, how we understand them are stereotype threat, which I'm not going to get into. So if you Google stereotype threat, you're going to get a lot of resources. Read Claude Steele's article on stereotype threat. Really goes into it, how it can impact testing. It could impact our functioning. Whenever reminded of a stereotyped identity and then have to perform a function right after that, it's oftentimes that reminder that's needed to trigger that internalized oppression to take over, and for that stereotype to then live and then to pretty much get in the way and provide additional challenges to our ability to succeed and to operate. Imposter phenomenon is probably one of the most common forms, though, that I see happening. And I go on my own experience. I still experience imposter phenomenon to this very day. Every single person in the world has some kind of imposterisms going on for them. But for folks who come from a socially marginalized or oppressed background, they also have that additional layer of imposterism to contend with that are coming from the internalized oppressions. Again, those stereotypes and those norms that are lies that we have then come to integrate into ourselves that then create that imposter phenomenon that we're experiencing. You might also have heard this called imposter syndrome, but we're trying to get away from using pathological terminology, right? It's not really a sickness or an illness that has been created within us, but it's a phenomenon that we can contend with. Again, it might make you feel like you're a fraud, right? Whenever have you been, maybe you've given a presentation and before the presentation, you've discounted yourself. You thought, oh, I don't have anything to offer. They're just gonna make fun of me. They're gonna find the holes in my presentation. They're gonna figure out that I am a fraud, that I don't belong here. Again, because of all those messages that we've internalized. We might actually devalue ourselves in some ways. So when we are congratulated for or given an accolade in some way, we might say, oh, that really wasn't me. That was my professor who helped me along the way, or that was my advisor who really gave me this opportunity. And I say, no, whenever we devalue ourselves, again, we're just feeding into that imposterism. It's great that we recognize those that have helped us, but we have to take responsibility and ownership over the successes that we have accomplished in our lives, right? And that's going to actually help us to counteract imposter phenomenon. And then we have that fear of finding out. wondering what some of your imposter phenomenon experiences might be. Again, as I mentioned, I experience these on a daily basis. Before I give a talk like this, that voice comes into mind and it says, David, you're not going to make sense. David, what you have to share isn't worthwhile. David, you don't even belong here, right? I still hear those voices and they sound like me, but now I know that those are the voices of the oppressor that have been implanted into my brain from early childhood to this very day. And it's taken on my voice. And so it's very tricky, right? It's trying to fool us. But it's a mechanism of oppression and of white supremacy, if we're talking about it in a racial context. But it's my job then to do some of these things. And so what I do to myself is I say, this is just imposter phenomenon, right? So I make sense of it. Again, critical consciousness raising helps us to make sense of these sometimes experiences that we have a hard time making sense of, right? When I first started doing microaggression presentations 10 plus years ago, and folks were hearing about it for the first time, the most common feedback I would get afterwards was, thank you for giving me a term to help me make sense of an everyday experience that I've been having that has literally been making me feel crazy. Now I feel a little bit, I feel some relief just knowing that this is something that is not of my doing, but of something that society is propagating. And the same is true with imposter phenomenon. As I mentioned, accept the roles that you've had in your successes. Again, I'm giving you some interventions right now for addressing this. Keep track of the nice things people say about you. One thing I have my students do is on the first day of class is to go around and introduce themselves by sharing their name, origin story, so that I can get their names right. And then also by sharing a strength. And I find that sometimes it's like pulling teeth, getting someone to share one strength. It shouldn't be. We should have a long list of strengths. Every single person has many, many strengths, but we often don't focus on them, right? And so if you're having a hard time naming your strengths, go to those in your life and ask them, what do you think are some strengths of mine? And I bet they're going to have a lot of things to tell you. Believe them, write them down, and create them into some kind of mantra that you can repeat day in, day out so that you start to internalize and believe them. Don't compare yourself to others. That's a very nasty habit that we've gotten into, especially with the advent of social media that's given us a platform to compare ourselves on a regular basis. Let's not do that, right? Let's not compare ourselves. We should understand that every single person has some kind of trial or tribulation or stress that they're enduring, even if they are presenting putting their best self forward day in, day out, that there's still something going on there. And so we have to believe that, and we have to know that we're our own person. Exposing ourselves for the good and the bad. Oftentimes failure in this society is something that is shied away from, when failure is an essential part of the learning process, and that's how we should conceptualize it, right? All learning is a set of failures in a way, right? As we're trying to perfect something. And so it's just a part of being who we are and a part of developing. Being wrong doesn't make me a fake, right? And just acknowledge that. I know I'm wrong on a regular basis. And when I try to hide it, people know it, right? But it doesn't make us a fake, right? And then the last one, to realize that nobody fully knows what they're doing, right? There's so many ways of doing everything. Even somebody who is the oldest person in the world is still trying to figure some things out in some way, shape, or form, right? Again, everyone's expertise has a limit. Even the most expert of the experts out there, their expertise has a limit because our knowledge is immense and we're still learning things. So no one fully knows what they are. Let me get into some impact really quick. Something else that I've been taking from the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of reframing. What are some of the lessons learned, right, during the pandemic so that we can grow from it? And one is the language that we're using, with the racial uprisings that continued during the pandemic and that gained prominence early on, really did help us to get to a place where we're actually calling things what they are. So racial trauma, we're using that term more frequently. We didn't use that very frequently pre-pandemic, but now we're using that to kind of describe the impacts of oppressions that we experience in society, microaggressions, the structural oppressions, et cetera, and that this actually induces trauma. And so we have trauma frameworks already that were pre-existing that we can then use to help people then heal from these experiences. And so what often happens is that racial trauma will often mimic PTSD. People will often find themselves not wanting to go into environments or contexts where they experience a lot of racial discrimination or racial trauma. Now, if that happens to be your campus or your institution, that's where I get very animated about and upset, because those are the places where people should feel like they can go to for support and for validation and for healing as well, right? And so let's think about what we're experiencing and the traumas that we have as well. Vicarious trauma, as I mentioned. So we don't need to be the immediate recipient of something to experience the trauma. All we have to do is witness it. This is why so many people in the social justice movements have been saying, do not watch people being killed repetitively, right? We don't need to see another Black person being killed to know what that experience is like, right? Those recordings are necessary, and I want to say those are necessary for evidence. However, we don't need to be viewing them day in, day out. And so I personally, when I know that there's a video that's going to come on TV of somebody else being killed, I don't need to see that to understand that pain and that impact. Like I've seen it before. So we have to kind of curate what we're taking in so that we're not also the recipients of too much undue vicarious trauma. Some of the issues, as I mentioned, that can result from this are disengaging from the educational environment, which can help us also explain the disparities that we still see in terms of graduation rates for students of color compared to white students. The development of a negative academic self-concept, right? If I'm not seeing people like me at the institution, if I'm not having professors who look like me, if I'm still enduring microaggressions that are ascribing me to a lower intellectual capacity, I'm likely to develop a negative academic self-concept, or the thought that I am not a good student, basically. A weak social support network, we're being cut off from sources of support, induces self-doubt, can induce racial battle fatigue or any other battle fatigue. So having to contend with microaggressions day in, day out brings upon a fatigue. It saps our cognitive and emotional resources. Our cognitive resources are limited and have to be replenished and restored on a daily basis. So if I'm not only contending with being in this pandemic situation, having to navigate taking care of other people in my life, worrying about finances or what have you, but now I'm having to contend with the racial discrimination as well. That's an additional layer of fatigue or experience that is adding to my overall fatigue. Survivor's guilt, especially for possibly first generation going college students who are going to college and getting a degree, knowing that they can't bring their entire family with them at that time, right? Or their entire community. And so they might feel a sense of survivor's guilt there. And then dignitary harm, which is something that hasn't been written about so often, but I heard the critical race theorist and intersectionality scholar, legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw speak once. And she mentioned dignitary harm as being a harm that results from when our identities are not fully seen, appreciated, affirmed, and validated, that we might feel like we have to splice ourselves off, right? And so if I'm in a situation and my race or ethnicity is being kind of compromised from that situation, or I'm not feeling appreciated there, right? I might then start to minimize that part of my identity in some kind of way. But that does some harm to my dignity, my sense of self-worth, my sense of believing that good things should come to me, right? And we need that sense of dignity to be heightened and to be intact. So to think about our dignity and how our dignity is also impacted by the oppressions that we experience in life. And then all these other well-being issues can happen as well. You name the disorder or the issue is likely impacted by microaggressions and oppression, including help-seeking behaviors. If a person is experiencing a lot of microaggressions in a certain context, they are less likely to go out and seek help from that context. So if they're experiencing them on campus, they're less likely to seek out some of those vital resources on campus that can help them navigate and heal from these experiences. They also lead us to do things in terms of coping maladaptively, such as using substances, right? So there's a lot of negative impacts that these can bring about if they're not processed or dealt with in appropriate ways. So I'm going to get us to some strategies for healing. And so there's again, racial trauma is something we've been speaking about in many ways pre-pandemic, but again, that have kind of reached more almost a mainstream way of understanding is how to deal with racial trauma. And so some things that we have to do when healing with racial trauma is acknowledge it, right? Being able to know what a racial stressor is, which takes us back to critical consciousness raising and the various ways that oppressions manifest, right? Via microaggression, via the internalized suppressions that we then have, et cetera. So being able to acknowledge and understand when racial stressors occur, right? So having the language is important. That consciousness raising, so again, contextualizing ourselves within a historical timeline, right? What's the history of my people, right? What's the history of my ancestors? What's the history of this community that I'm now embedded in, right? And how is that history currently impacting the dynamics of what's going on right now? Self-care, including mindfulness, which is why I started this off with a direct intervention from the start, reconnecting with our body and our mind. And again, mindfulness is one of those very accessible interventions that you can practice nearly anytime, anywhere. You can memorize. I even have on my phone, I have a very short meditation that I can read. Let's say I'm flying somewhere and I start to get stressed out or what have you. I can easily go to that on the airplane and read that to help bring myself to where back reconnected to myself and my body. Seeking support, connecting to our cultural roots again, as I mentioned, and then sometimes activism can be another essential component for some people. I'm going to take us through a racism recovery plan that we can utilize. And I think that this is another important concept to think about. Whenever we know that we're likely to experience something, we can plan for it. So we know that when we get into a vehicle, a car or a plane or a train, maybe not train, I don't see seatbelts there very often, but especially a car, right? We know that we put our seatbelt on because we know there's a likelihood of us getting into an accident, right? Stats have showed us that. I don't know many people who haven't been in some kind of accident in a car. But that we do that. And so if we can think about racism in a similar fashion, right? What critical race theory teaches us accurately is that racism is a normed part of society and is something that, because it's normed, that we can just expect to experience, right? And so if we can take that and internalize that, then we should be able to, then be motivated to plan for it, right? So what is my racism seatbelt, if you will, right? What is my seatbelt that can help me to deal with and minimize the impacts of racism? And I'm going to take you through a recovery plan here. I'm also going to give you this as a resource. I'll drop this into the chat as a PDF and it will also be circulated to those who have registered. But there are 7 steps. So 7 actionable things that you can practically do right now tonight, or whenever we're done with this. Or maybe even do this, start this while we're going over this. The first step is to reflect on a time when you've responded to racism in a healthy way. You might think, well, how do you respond to racism in a healthy way? Well, there are so many ways that are healthier than others. I know that there's a specific person I have to work with on a regular basis. And whenever I have to work with this person, I know that I'm going to expect some kind of oppression, not just race. There's also classism embedded there and other issues from this person. At times I've literally lashed out, right? Because I've just had it up. I've been fed up. That didn't lead to anything good on the other end. And then there's times when I go to my phone. I have a number of chat groups of close friends, some who also study the same phenomenon. And I say, this just happened to me. And then what I receive is validation and affirmation of my experience, right? Which is what I need. So that's the more healthier way of responding. So reflect on ways that you can respond in a way that's going to be healthier for you. Then you have to reflect on your daily upkeep. What do you do to stay centered? So what do you do in your life to make sure that you're coping with life in a way that is optimal for yourself? Are you getting the sleep that you need? Are you eating healthy and regularly, right? Are you getting regular medical attention and treatment? But then are there other things that you're doing? Are you doing mindfulness? Are you attending to your physical health? Are you attending to your financial health, et cetera? So what are you doing on a daily basis? Every single thing that you're doing, right? So don't discount even the smallest thing, right? Am I drinking an adequate number of glasses of water, right? Am I staying hydrated? Those are all part of us maintaining our daily upkeep. And so again, that's a major part of this. I'm going to give you some specific worksheets for doing this in a more critical way. Identifying stressful situations. And so again, we can plan for it. So I know whenever I have a meeting with this person, there's going to be things said that I'm going to have reactions to that are probably coming from microaggressions, right? And so I can prepare for that. So I often will do a mindfulness meditation before that meeting, right? I might even like prep my friends. I'm like, okay, I'm entering into a meeting with this person, expect some messages to come, right? So I'm preparing myself and as much as possible for this event. Just the act of preparing for an event like this can actually be healing in and of itself. It can put you into a space where you might feel more armored, more protected, and more ready to kind of engage in the situation. Anticipating the early warning signs for when you are experiencing emotional stress. What are those like? Sometimes we don't experience them emotionally first, or we might not even have the cognitive capability to process it, but sometimes we feel it physically, right? So I know that my shoulders tend to go up. And so now with this, being able to see myself as I talk, if I see my shoulders kind of get like this, that means I'm getting tension here and that I need to go and do something. So that's one of my early warning signs. Sometimes I have a hard time with my cognitive processing. That might actually lower because of it as well. So I might find a hard time searching for words, et cetera. So what are your early warning signs when you're experiencing any kind of maladaptive experience or negative experience, but especially when you're experiencing a racially traumatic experience? The next one comes to our planning. So an acute response plan. So what are you going to do in that moment when you're experiencing this, right? Are you going to meet with somebody afterwards? Are you going to participate in some kind of activism? Are you going to share with a trusted friend or family member? And literally you're writing out this plan in advance so that you know what to do and when to do it. So for me, again, I already told you, I text my friends, my friend groups, so I can kind of share that and be seen, get that consensual validation from them, that I am experiencing my world accurately as I understand it, right? Crisis planning. So now we want to know kind of a larger picture for this plan, right? Especially if you are possibly thinking of harming yourself or harming somebody else, right? So that's when we're really in crisis. What are you going to do then, and who are you going to contact? This should be a who will you contact. So there should be a name of somebody trusted that you have easy access to, who you've also discussed this plan with, so that they know when you contact them why you're contacting them, right? And so this is an important person or people to have as your crisis points of contact for when you're feeling really out of sorts and possibly feeling like you're going to harm yourself or harm somebody else especially. And then we get into post-crisis recovery. What are you going to do afterwards to fully take care of yourself? So what are some of those strategies to reconnect with yourself? For me, it's often cooking something for myself. And I cook, I love cooking my mom's enchilada recipe. And so that's also from my cultural background. So I'm connecting to my cultural roots, connecting to my ancestors. I know my mom got that recipe from others. And so I'm kind of invoking my ancestors, my food, my culture to help with the healing process as well. I'm nourishing myself by eating, right? And so those are some of the things that I do for my post-crisis recovery. So again, there's a website that's going to be linked on the resources that I share that you can then look at to go through these steps more. There's also an article, a PDF that will take you to a very, very short article that's written by my colleagues, Dr. Janet Helms and her research team at Boston College are who put this together. So I want to make sure they get adequate credit. So the self-care strategies, and if this is something that everyone can do, we only have 5 minutes left, but I find that this is very helpful for you to share one way that you care for yourself in any of these various aspects of your life. So share a self-care strategy. I shared some of mine. Another one of mine is my dog, who is sleeping right over here in her dog bag. She likes being in her dog bag. She's one of those dogs. Many dogs don't like being in their dog bag, but anyhow, my dog is a very important coping mechanism for me. But when we share these with each other, we can then learn other strategies. So if everyone would share one coping mechanism that they use for themselves. Looking at our time, and I want to give a few minutes for any questions that might have. So these are the worksheets that will help you take a more critical lens to your self-care practices. So what is your current practice? And then what's a new practice? Our self-care practices often have a shelf life, and they're often not going to be available in every context. You know, the pandemic context cut off a lot of what people do for exercise, the gym, right? So people had to pivot to do other things. So think about the other areas of your self-care and think about, is this self-care practice still working like it was last year or 5 years ago? And if it's not, what else can I do? You also want to think about barriers to maintaining your self-care strategies, and then how you remind yourself of these barriers, and then thinking about your negative coping strategies, right? Such as substance use, that's a negative coping strategy. And what will you do instead? Some other things, developing a balanced schedule, incorporating well-being checks into your daily life, right? You're the best expert in your mental health and well-being. And so that can be using the wonderful language of emojis and on your calendar, in your on your phone, or wherever you have your calendar, just putting the emoji that kind of matches your mood at the end of the day, right? And then taking stock of that. So you want to review that periodically at the end of the week, at the end of 2 weeks. And when you find that maybe you're not feeling so well after 2 weeks or a month, that might be your cue to go and seek out external help from possibly a counselor or some other kind of healthcare professional. Mindfulnessforteens.com. And I like that a lot of folks are using social support. Social support is one of our main sources of coping as human beings. Continually emphasizing your strengths. There's going to be some more resources on here for how to offer help to your peers or to others. I'm not asking anybody on this call to be a therapist. Even those of you that are trained, it's, we know that we don't do therapy with those that are in our close circles, but we can offer them other support. And this VAR method of providing support to somebody in need is very accessible and very practical, and anybody can do it. Validating someone's feelings, appreciating their courage for seeking you out, and then referring them to some kind of skill or some kind of support, maybe even one that you are taking in right now. If you're ever in crisis and you don't have somebody to contact with directly, 741-741 is crisis text line. And that's a resource that anybody can use at any time. And with their partnership with the Steve Fund, we've helped them to become more culturally responsive. And so if you text Steve to that and you're a person of color, you're going to be matched with somebody who has been trained to work in a culturally responsive way. Critiquing your mental health resources, knowing that they're not all made the same. So again, this is a resource I'm going to give you. And so what I want, we have 2 minutes left. I'm sorry for taking up all the time. I'm going to stop sharing there and see if there are any questions that folks have. I don't have to leave right at 3, but I know others might have to. I'm going to drop in here the handout. So now you have the handout with those resources, which are mostly from the ending of the slide deck. So I didn't see any questions in the chat. If there's anything here that we have some time to answer, I'm more than happy to take those questions. Yeah, taking a nice bath or a hot shower or a warm shower can actually help to calm someone down as well. So thank you for sharing those with us. All right.
I want to thank you for attending and coming and helping us today. I found a lot of things in that discussion that you had with us relevant to me and things that I hadn't even thought of. And you really helped me think about how I could be a better person for our students, for my colleagues, and also, a better student, a better person for myself in terms of self-care, because I have not done a very good job of that. So please, thank you very much for coming. To our students, an email will be coming out to you regarding when you can pick up your swag bag. And I think that's about it. Again, I do apologize for my technology skills, and I want to thank Strategic Marketing for helping us out as well. And Mr. Rivera, we'll be in touch, at least I will. Maybe you could come on in and speak with our SOMOS students, which is another population of students that we have. And I'll speak to Susanna Santiago about that. Okay. But I really want to thank everybody, and everybody, please stay safe, okay?
Be well, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera.